Hey everybody, before we get started, wanted to bring your attention to my best friend Dan has a cat named Skeeter who has FIP, which is a very upsetting disease for your cat to have, and he's trying to raise money for the experimental drugs for it that are quite expensive. So if you go to bit.ly/save Skeeter, that's bit.ly/SAVESKEETER, you can help raise money for them to pay for their cat's medicine to keep her alive. So it would really mean a great deal to me if you did that. So please check that out, bit.ly/save Skeeter. And now, on with the show. I'm Jason Klom, and this is Comedy on Vinyl. The year is 1968, the album, an album of political pornography. The group, Lou Irwin and the Credibility Gap, and my guest this week is Lou Irwin. Thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
So this is an album I've had sitting in the collection for a long time, and for those who are not aware, as we were discussing a moment ago, who the Credibility Gap was in 1968 was very different from who they were even a couple years after, or even a year after. I'd like to talk...
A week after, actually.
Even a week after, okay.
We made a lot of changes.
Let's talk about your career and then what led to you to the making of this album and the group that gathered to become the first iteration of the Credibility Gap. Okay.
What would you like to know?
Well, I'd like to know, you're a journalist, but what made you want to start a satirical group and do comedy at all?
Well, I started in 1955 in radio doing traditional newscasts or semi-traditional newscasts. Speaking like newscasters used to speak back then, with this big booming voice, the voice of God, that sort of thing. And I did that on television and on radio for a number of years. I started in television in 1956 on Channel 9 in Los Angeles. I moved to Channel 7 a year later as the first anchor on the ABC station here. Wow. But I worked in radio, pretty consistently during all of that.
Okay.
From 1956 until 1964. Mm-hmm. And I went to New York and I saw Second City in New York while I was there. I worked at WCBS TV on a show called Eye on New York. And while I was there, I went to Greenwich Village and I saw the Second City, the Chicago group performing there. And they were doing topical satire. Mm-hmm. And about a couple of years later, there was a television show called That Was the Week That Was.
Yeah.
That was hosted by David Frost. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And that gave me the idea of including topical satire with the news. And I was working at KRLA in Los Angeles a few years later, beginning in 1965, and had conversations with the manager there for ages.
Yeah.
And ultimately convinced him that it would be a great idea to do a newscast that would include topical satire and topical music with the news. That would be ideal for a rock and roll radio station. So that's how it came about.
Wow. It's interesting that, that obviously the idea has to come from somewhere. But rarely do you ever get to hear it from one of the people who got to be one of the early creators of that kind of work. During this period, did you ever have any run-ins with Peter Bergman or any of the other Firesign Theater guys just because of the KRLA connection?
Well, yes. They did the commercials on the Credibility Gap for a while, and then later on, Bergman and what is the other?
Maybe Osman, possibly, or no. Phil Proctor?
Phil Proctor, Bergman and Proctor, did comedy sketches on a show that I produced for syndication on radio called Hot News. And I did some work on one of their albums, on Osmond's album, I think.
Oh, wow.
And
That I did not know.
I mean, I don't remember what I did, but he gave me credit on it. And I know I was on it, that's all.
I love it. That's now I'm gonna have to look that up because, as usual, the internet has failed me there. Oh, you know what? I won't bother looking it up. I'll ask my friend who is their archivist, and the second I mention your name, he'll be like, "Yes, of course I knew that. Here's exactly where you can find Lou Irwin." I'm sure he will know. So you start that, and then what was the general format of what you were doing of your first foray into comedy and news?
Well, I mean. First of all, I didn't want to do a show that was strictly funny news. I wanted to do, good investigative reports that they couldn't get, that especially kids couldn't get anywhere else. And I wanted to use comedy as social satire, as a kind of editorial cartoon, if you will. An audio editorial cartoon. And that hadn't been done on radio before. And we were doing 3 different 15-minute newscasts every day that were repeated later on in the day, but with different news content. And it really worked. The news programs on KRLA were the news hours on KRLA were the highest rated on the station, which was incredible for a rock and roll radio station. That never happened. I don't think that it's ever happened on any music station where the news got better ratings than the music.
That's crazy. Wow. I mean, it's a testament, obviously, to knowing your audience, but not just knowing your audience, knowing there's a whole generation of people who needed this, seemingly needed this version of the news. They needed some sort of outlet. Could you tell, well, what was it? I was going to ask, could you tell what it was sort of activating in them, and what need it was meeting? But what need was it meeting for you? Was there pent up anger, aggression, stress over, what was it that you were exercising?
Creativity, it gave me a great chance to do things I wouldn't ordinarily be able to do. And I just loved working with those guys. It was, as I said, we changed constantly. We changed staff constantly. I really wanted to start out with using some of the guys who were in Second City. And we couldn't afford it initially. Not because of how much we would have to pay them, but how much we would have to pay severance fees for the guys who were already working at KRLA. So we started out working with the guys who were working at KRLA, except that I fired the sportscaster and brought in Len Chandler to do the music on those shows. And he wrote a song, 3 songs a day for over a year. That's over 1,000 songs in a year.
Oh my God.
And some of the stuff was really brilliant, and most of it was. And I could also say, so far as the comedy was concerned, most of that was very funny. Sometimes we just bombed, but the audience stayed with us. If we did stuff that was just mediocre, they would come back, 3 hours later for the next newscast, and hopefully we would have something that would be, right on.
Wow. I mean, that's how much of this stuff survives, if any of it? Like, how much of that is it archived somewhere, or do I want to know?
I wish I knew where the tapes were. I left the station in a huff a year later. The program director and the general manager went to work for the Smothers Brothers Company.
Oh, wow.
And left me in the hands of a couple of guys who, they wanted to cut everything, cut costs. And it was, I was really frustrated with having to come to work every day and work under those conditions.
Yeah.
And finally, they said that I had to cut all of the little people. They just wanted me to do the comedy stuff.
Oh, wow.
And
Okay.
I had to cut all the reporters, the field reporters, and I just left.
Yeah. I mean, it's, especially if you're used to having this kind of creative freedom, how else are you supposed to feel except like, well, I've got to be able to do it my way, especially something like this, which I feel is important.
Mm-hmm.
How much, so at that point, once you left, who and what was the group? Who were still a part of the Credibility? It was, I mean, obviously yourself, Len Chandler, and there were some other folks, but on the record.
And Bob Goodwin.
Okay.
And Harry Shearer and Richard Beebe were there at the time that I left. Richard had been there for 22 years or something like that at KRLA. He started there at KRLA when KRLA became a music station.
Okay.
So they would have had to pay him a lot if he came with me. I wanted to try to syndicate the Credibility Gap and made a deal with Metro Media. That just didn't work out. We supplied them with comedy bits and Len's music, and they were going to include that in their own newscasts, except that the newscasters didn't want any part of that. And they made it sound really bad. we started on a local station, KLIC, I think. But at any rate, it was just bad. And I knew that we were in trouble, that we weren't going to be able to get these on other Metro Media stations if I didn't have control of the whole program.
Does this record have anything from any actual broadcast, or is this like your attempt at condensing 1968 into a record as a separate project?
No, the idea for the album came from Blue Thumb Records. Okay. And we were going to do an album that would come out prior to the election in 1968. And that didn't work out so well. We recorded the album, but it sat for, I don't know, a couple of months before they could get distribution.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And it came out after the election, which took its toll on sales. But the idea, we started on KRLA doing the Credibility Gap on the day before the primary election in 1968.
Okay.
And I had, at that time, an actuality news service that I had sold to a print service, a city news service, just a couple of months earlier, just so that I could do the Credibility Gap. I couldn't operate that news service and do the Gap at the same time. So we started the day before the primary election in California. I still at that time had just completed work for the Kennedy campaign using the same equipment that we had used for the actuality service. And we were feeding the excerpts from Kennedy's speeches in Oregon and California to stations in Oregon and California. And the night before the election, or the night of the election, I had just edited his victory speech in California, handed it to the girl who was feeding the stations, and was going over to the Ambassador Hotel to try to get the business for the national election, assuming that Kennedy was going to be the candidate. And I was just going out the door of KRLA when the girl came running out the door and said, "Lou, he's been shot." And it was an interesting evening.
Uh-huh.
Len composed like 6 different songs that we ran that night, and I did, the news stories connected with his assassination, Kennedy's assassination.
Mm-hmm.
It was an all-night job, and Len did some wonderful work.
Yeah.
And we proceeded from there to do maybe a couple of months of shows, and Blue Thumb came and proposed that we do a political show that we could release just before the election.
Mm-hmm.
And I jumped on the chance, and we had the scripts already written. So we went to a recording studio, picked out a few scripts, recorded them, blended some songs. It was a very fast job. I think we did all of it in a few hours.
Oh my God.
And
wow.
It was, and that was the genesis of that album you have.
Wow. Holy cow. There are a number of things on the record that I've wanted, obviously had questions about, but there are some Vox recordings that I'm assuming are acted out, but a couple of them sound so real that I have questioned them ever since. Are any of them real on the street interviews, or are they all acted?
Oh, there are no actors. I've never used actors.
Wow.
No. Well,
okay.
I mean, the comedy bits are
sure.
Obviously are actors, but no, all of those people were. I had a guy in Chicago recording Man of the Street stuff at the conventions.
Yeah. Holy cow. Okay, so that's what threw me, because some of they are such characters. The choice to include them is so strong, where it's like, these can't be real. There are a couple where I'm like, they cannot, but all right, that is good to know. I love hearing that. That's it's not. I can only think of like maybe Mal Sharp, maybe some other people at the time would have, or around that time would have had that kind of stuff on their records, but this is the only other time, because obviously this has got it's news centric. Sorry, I'm looking at the back and I have to ask, 3 of you are not wearing your shirts in this, and it's a fantastic photo. I love it so much. Whose idea was this back photo?
No, the idea was we're producing an album of pornography.
Fair.
You know, somebody who didn't want to take off their shirts. I can't remember.
Oh yeah. Okay. So
Len is in the middle. That's Richard Beebe behind me.
Richard Beebe's behind you. Okay.
Yeah. John Gilliland and Len didn't want to take off their shirts. Yeah.
You know what? Fair enough. Now, who's the cover? I have never known who the cover image is of.
I don't know.
You don't know?
Idea. No.
Oh my God.
That was Blue Thumb's creation.
That's that's hilarious. What do you know what their interest was? Because I mean, if I look at their discography up to that point, it's not entirely this, but it's a lot of Ike and Tina Turner. So, what were they going into comedy, or what had they done some comedy to your knowledge?
No, this was one of their first. They had 3 albums out. Mm-hmm. They debuted with 3 albums. I told you that they had problems getting distribution. But I know that we were one, and then there was Beefheart.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and then I can't remember the third, but we were one of the first 3 albums on Blue Thumb. So
okay,
what they did afterwards, I'm not at all familiar with.
That's crazy. Okay, all right. So they were just trying their hand at a little bit of everything. I love that. Cover body painting by David Greenberg. Yes, but who is the man in the cover? That's what album. You're not telling me anything. I love that. Okay, so that quick of a turnaround. I mean, maybe that's not unusual, maybe, but it sounds. It's got a great sound to it. It's produced in a very. It envelops you with a lot of the music of the time. It is. A lot of times when we'll have somebody come on here and talk about an album they love, they'll be like, it's a perfect snapshot at the time. This is a snapshot of literally a single day in terms of like everything is built up to this in 1968. But as of this one particular day, This is everything that had happened. This is kind of your concept of the world. This is so much. There's so much talk. Most of it is no, all of it is still relevant. Maybe only dated in a couple bits of terminology, but there's so much about violence, gun violence specifically. It also does ring of some of my other favorite stuff of the era, specifically the Smothers Brothers. There's some just real, you take some very hard stances, understandably, on things like gun violence and stuff. How quickly did you turn around any of those scripts, or were they just sort of feverishly written? I'm curious what your process was for writing this stuff.
Well, we did comedy bits off the cuff, as I say, 3 times a day. They were all scripted. Nothing was improvised.
Yeah.
We worked to the last minute before airtime, and many times there were situations where the first part of the show was already on the air, and we were still recording the second part of the show. We worked out a relay plan to toss the tapes down the stairway to someone who would catch it at the bottom of the stairway and rush it into the engineer's booth. And we never had dead air.
Oh my God. And this is, again, I'll remind people, this is when you had to cut physical tape, so it's no small feat to make this stuff happen. Oh, wow. Yeah. Wow. What was your feeling on completion of this record? Because it's different when you do a day-to-day thing, something that is ephemeral, something that is hopefully not lost to time, but as far as you knew, nobody's going to necessarily hear this stuff again. But you do finally get a record that at least plants a little bit of it solidly in history. This will be stuff people can look back on. How did you feel about this record when it was finished, even though it got released way too late?
Oh, I was pleased with it. I thought we had some really good stuff on there. I especially loved the parody of Oral Roberts and the challenge that this guy in Africa, I believe, had he had challenged him to a faith healing contest.
Right. Yes.
Who could? I thought that was probably the most absurd thing that had happened during that time. It did not really relate to political anything, but I thought we just had to get that into the album.
I mean, but that's
I understand that the people at that time really were familiar with how wrestling was broadcast, and we did this as a, using the typical phraseology of these wrestling announcers. And it was, I thought, hysterical. Anybody over the age of 60 today and who remembers those wrestling shows will relate to that bit.
It's great. I mean, that is one of the things that I think holds up best because, again, anything that reminds you of what the hell is still going on, even though we don't think of faith healing in the same way, I guess. Maybe it's not. I don't know, but I don't know. I love it. In terms of, I feel like we've seen since stuff like this, seen this stuff get over satirized, but that is one of my favorite bits on that subject matter in general. It's really brilliant. I'm just trying to. Oh, you know what? Let me pull the actual record because then I can have the track listing in front of me. Because there's not a track listing on the record itself or on the sleeve. Let's see here. Yeah, there's so much. I mean, did you have any reservations about? I mean, it doesn't sound like you did, but I mean, we see this happen a lot. When 9/11 happened, early on in COVID, there's always the political tragedy happens, real legitimate tragedy happens, and then comedians or people who do satire question their very existence and whether or not they should keep doing satire. But it sounds like you just kept pounding the pavement even after, hope seemed dead after RFK is assassinated. Did you have any thoughts of should we stop, or is it just keep moving because what we're doing is important?
No, I never had any reluctance. at all to continue doing that.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I did have some reservations about some of Harry Shearer's contributions
Mm-hmm.
because I thought they were too heavy-handed.
Okay.
But other than that, I got along fine with everybody.
Mm-hmm.
I was able to eventually use Second City people on the show,
Mm-hmm.
and I had a wonderful working relationship with Severn Darden and Avery Schreiber
Mm-hmm.
and Jack Burns, and they contributed some wonderful stuff to the show. As a matter of fact, after I left KRLA, I did a half-hour weekly show on KCET, the public television station in Los Angeles, called The Musical Muse. And those guys worked with us and lended some wonderful stuff. I was really pleased with that. I do have a couple of clips that I might be able to send along to you from that show. It was a lot of fun.
I would love to see that. Were they, so these were people who were Second City? I mean, obviously I know Burns and Schreiber and Severn Darden. Had they already then transplanted to LA to do all this, to work with you, or were they, do you know?
All of them, I think, moved out here just about the same time.
Okay.
I brought Len out to do the credibility gap, but I think Severn and Avery were already here.
Mm-hmm.
Not quite sure, but I think that they were already in LA.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah. Oh my goodness, I would love to see, if you do have anything that's sitting around, I would love to see that.
I wish we had some of their credibility gap shows.
Sure. Yeah.
I wish I had any of those shows. Period. I think I found. No, somebody sent me a recording of one show that was kind of typical. And, it was not one of those shows where everybody is at their peak.
Sure.
But it was, it was typical. And I think I've got a recording of that I could send on to you.
Oh my goodness. I mean, that would be fantastic. It's because, like, when you hear, especially, there are certain groups that, there's this weird situation here. Exactly what we're talking about is that once the group changes and the credibility gap becomes considerably a different group, they become their own thing and then evolve slightly into something else. Even on the third album, even though they're the same people, it's a totally different sounding album. So the credibility gap has become this very weird evolutionary system. We have more evidence of the work done by the later group than we do, obviously, the progenitor of it. And that's hours and hours and hours and hours and hours of stuff that I would imagine most survives because of fans. I will bet there are other fans. I know that Firesign has found that. Sometimes if they don't have something, their fans have recorded it, 40 years ago off the radio.
Yeah.
Wow.
You've got to understand that originally the credibility gap was not a group.
Right. Okay.
It was a show.
Just a show, yes.
And
that's fair, yeah.
And we made a lot of changes. Mm-hmm. The main reason was that people burned out. Mm-hmm. It's very difficult to do this kind of stuff day in and day out. Mm-hmm. And Richard Beebe was the only one who stayed with the show for the entire time that I was there.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Do you think that was just because he was used to the radio grind, or do you have any?
I think so. Yeah. None of the other people had ever worked in radio before.
Right.
David Lander, who went on to be Squiggy on Laverne and Shirley, mm-hmm. He worked with us for a long time. But before he started, he was working on a phone service. An answering service.
Wow.
And somebody called and said, God, this guy is really funny. You should try to use him on the air. And we did, and he lasted a long time on the show and continued with the group mm-hmm. after the show went off the air.
Well, let's talk about Len Chandler's contribution. And did you know of him already as a singer? Did you run into him in New York when you were watching The Second City?
In 1965, I did a documentary called "What Will the Harvest Be?" For ABC, and Len did the incidental music for it. It was about the birth of the Black Panther Party.
Oh, wow!
Which was was considerably different from the Black Panther Party that emerged in Oakland. This one was an offshoot of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, and they were organizing in a county in Alabama, I can't think of it, Lowndes County, Alabama, a Get Out the Vote campaign there. A woman, Viola Liuzzo, who was working for SNCC at that time, was murdered by the Klan just a few months earlier. So I went down there to do this documentary about the Black Panther Party. This, if you might remember the name Stokely Carmichael.
Yeah.
Stokely was a member of SNCC at that time, and he was the one who instigated this Get Out the Vote campaign in Lowndes County. And I did a half-hour documentary, and Len did the music for it, the incidental music for it. And it was brilliant. I told him about the scenes that we were going to use. I was staying in a motel at the time with a cameraman. Len would go into the bathroom with his typewriter and guitar and turn out the songs that we used.
Wow.
It was, and all of this was done within a few hours. And I thought if he could do this in a few hours for us, he could do stuff. He could do topical satire for our program.
Yeah.
And as I said, 1,000 songs in a year.
Oh, wow. This sort of run and gun guerrilla thing it came up again recently on something else that I was talking about, but to be able to not just execute anything, but to execute something that ends up being funny or at least poignant, but also usually funny and poignant is remarkable. And that you got a guy who I don't know enough about Len's training as a musician. I know of his music, of course, and I know part of the movements that he was a part of. But I would be curious to know what gave him that kind of. I mean, he just sounds like he was just ridiculously prolific. That's I can't wrap my head around writing songs that quick at all.
Yeah.
Wow.
No, amazing talent. Most talented man I've ever met.
Yeah.
He's still a good friend.
Yeah. Wow. That's so good. And it is, the music is a huge part of this record too. It's a very environmentally full record. There's no space wasted. There's always some music. There's always something going on to keep your attention and keep your emotions tied into what's happening on the record. Did you, after The Credibility Gap, what's your history with comedy? Have you done other comedy stuff? You did the show. You did the TV show that you mentioned.
No, I did a syndicated radio show called Earth News Radio for 14 years. And I interviewed a lot of comedians during that time. Some were funny, some were not. Probably the funniest interview I've ever done was one with Peter Sellers. Before that was part of the Goons. And they did topical satire in England.
Sure.
But it was an hysterical interview. I did part of the interview with him as Inspector Clouseau.
Oh my God!
And
really?
I mean, he was willing to play. I said, Inspector, I understand that you've become a great expert at karate. And he says, oh, no, it's not karate. It's the Israeli art of judo. He said, we get the leverage from the nose.
Oh my God. Oh my God.
God, he was so funny. He talked about the initial controversy of the Goon Show and how the BBC reacted to it. And he did an impersonation of the members of the BBC all meeting together over this show. Mm-hmm. And he says, well, what is this go on show?
Go on. I love it. Oh, that's so good. Wow, that's remarkable. I did look at the list of people that you have interviewed, and obviously outside of comedians, we're talking I don't know how many presidents that you interviewed, but going back to Truman, did I see Truman on there? On that list?
Oh yeah. Truman was a great interview. Yeah. I mean, I didn't interview him when he was president.
Sure.
Not that old. Right. But I many times, as a matter of fact, Truman gave me a great interview when I was doing a series about the Hollywood blacklist. Mm-hmm. And my interview with him ended up on the headline in Variety.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And I knew Jack Kennedy pretty well. I interviewed him a couple of times and then talked to him about, I told him that I was working with Desilu on this documentary series, and that they might be interested in a series based on his book, Profiles in Courage. Uh-huh. And he was interested, and we worked together on putting together a presentation. Nothing came of it, but I got to know him pretty well. Mm-hmm. Used to take him to the airport regularly.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah, and he gave me a really good scoop during the campaign. It wasn't anything earth-shaking, but he came into LA and I met him at the airport, and he said, I'm going to announce later on today, and you can only attribute this to a reliable source. You can't tell anyone who told you this, but I'm going to announce that Jackie is pregnant, and that if she has a son, it's going to be the first child ever born to a sitting president.
Oh my goodness!
And I got that on the air really quickly.
I bet. Holy cow!
Yeah.
That's ridiculous. Did you ever? Okay, so you may not know, but there are mixed opinions as to what he thought of the First Family album. Do you have any idea what he actually thought of the First Family record?
No, I think he said something that to the effect that he thought that what was his name?
Vaughn Meter.
Yes, he thought that he sounded more like Teddy than himself.
Yes, I did hear that. You know what? That's a man with a sense of humor. That's hilarious. Had you, boy, oh boy. Do you think you would was there any chance that you would have done other Credibility Gap albums if the group had stayed as what it was when you put it together? Again, it was a program, obviously, but yeah.
I would love to have done that, yeah.
Yeah. Did you, was there anything, so I know that journalists are usually, one must be impartial as a journalist, et cetera, et cetera. How did you did you have any internal debate over the fact that you're also doing satire, which is inherently, it's not necessarily a biased thing, but it is definitely taking jabs, and people can assume it to be biased. Did you ever feel torn up about doing that and being a journalist at the same time?
Yeah. There are times many times that I've had this thing of, is this really a conflict of interest? Mm-hmm. Sure, just reading a commercial, I've balked at doing that. I think that's a conflict of interest.
Yeah, that's fair. But I mean, there is also the argument to be made, but hell, I have to stay on the air in order to get this out. And at the very least, I don't know. I'm a person who could never be a journalist because I'm way too opinionated. So that's why I'm always so curious when someone who is a journalist either goes into comedy or also does it at the same time as doing journalism is rare. So it's fascinating to me that, you kept your head above water and could still do both competently. That's remarkable. I don't know how one handles themselves in that. I could never do it, as I said. Growing up, Was there any, what kind of comedy did you have in the house? What were you listening to? What were the first comedy records in the house, if any?
I didn't have any comedy records
None.
in the
Okay.
house, but I did. I grew up. Radio was part of my life.
Mm-hmm.
Every weekend, I would go to the radio shows that were produced, the audience shows that were produced in Hollywood. Jack Benny and Red Skelton and all of those. Every weekend of my life, I went to those radio
Really?
shows.
Oh my God.
Saw the shows to the East Coast in the afternoon. Went back and saw the West Coast shows in the evening. Sometimes the dress rehearsals that they had those. I did that every weekend when school was in session, and during summer vacation, I went every day. They were free, great.
Yeah.
You were seeing some great comedy, also some great drama,
Mm-hmm.
and live actors on stage, and orchestras on stage.
Mm-hmm.
It was a great time.
Wow.
I did that from the time I was 12 years old, pretty much to the time that I started in radio.
Wait, okay, now could you, was it just a different time, as they say, and you could just go on your own as a 12-year-old kid, just show up and they'll let you in the audience? Or did you go with your parents?
No, I had sent away for tickets.
Yeah, yeah.
And there were a lot of radio groupies around me in those days. Some my age, I met a lot of kids who went to those shows. Wow. CBS, the age limit was 12, and NBC was 14. Couldn't wait till I was 14 so I could go see to the NBC shows.
Yeah.
But about that time, all of the big comedy shows were moving from NBC to CBS.
Oh, okay. When you got into radio yourself, can you remember the first person you ever got to speak to or interview who might have been somebody you saw perform as a kid? I'm assuming that must have happened at some point. Like you get to interview a Jack Benny or something.
Oh my God, I interviewed so many comedians.
Sure.
I mean, early one, Jack Benny and Eddie Cantor and people of that generation. I did that when I first started in radio. I wanted to interview those people, the people that I used to go to see.
Yeah.
And as I say, some of those people wanted to be some other than a comedian. They wanted. I interviewed Sid Caesar, and he wanted to talk about foreign policy. It was just ridiculous.
Foreign diplomacy. Oh my God! Wow.
Yeah.
From what I know of him, though, you're lucky he didn't try and throw you out a window. That's what I understand about Sid Caesar. The man was intimidating and scary and large. That's all I get of him as a younger man. Wow.
Yeah. Well, I had heard the same rumors about Peter Sellers.
Sure.
But he was great, just great. When Sellers arrived for the interview, he had a photo album of still photos that were taken by the set photographer for Strangelove.
Uh-huh.
And it turned out that the guy that Kubrick had hired to take the photos was a news photog named Ouija, who was famous for doing for his coverage of murders and street street crime, and he was telling me about Ouija setting up these fancy setups to capture scenes in the movie, and Kubrick would walk in and say, "All right, Ouija, we've got to shoot now. Take that stuff down," before he could even do anything.
God.
Yeah.
Not surprised, I guess, but wow.
And amazing that they would use a news photographer as
Yeah.
a set photographer on Strangelove.
I've never heard of such a thing. That's really funny. Is there, and apologies if there already is, but is A, have you written a book about your life? B, are you going to? And C, can I read it? I guess is.
I might do that.
Yeah.
If for no, I'm hardly a household word. I can't imagine why anybody would buy a book about Lou Irwin. But I think I might do that just for my kids and
Sure.
my grandkids and that sort of thing. Yeah.
I mean, there's just a lot there. I mean, I'm a firm believer that household name or not, I used to be very cynical about the whole idea that everybody has a story until I started digging into some people that I would not have given a crap about a few years before, and then realized, oh right, I'm just missing a little bit of context. I feel like all you need is context to understand why somebody's story might be of interest, and it's just. You've gone all over the place and done a lot of stuff, and there's probably a billion other things I could ask you about, but I chose to stick to the one comedy album you've done. I really wish I knew which Osman album you were on. I'm gonna have to ask them after we're done here and just get a little. Maybe they can send me a clip or something, because I would love to know what it was, in what way you were involved.
Well, I think all you have to do is Google it. Just Google
I was looking,
Irwin.
Yeah. Okay. Well, then I will dig right after this then, because, well, you know what? I'll do it right now, because I'm wondering why, because you know why, I was looking on discogs.com, which sometimes is really complete and sometimes is not at all. And oh yeah. Okay. Wait, hold on. Yeah. Here we are. Yeah. It's How Time Flies. Okay. Yeah. Which is his 1973 record, which is one that I own but have not heard yet. I apologize to David, friend of the show. Yeah, okay. Yeah, you're on here. All right. That's all right. So we've got, oh my goodness. There's a lot of people listed on here, including yourself, including Harry Shearer, including Phil Austin, and all the Fire Sign guys, and Wolfman Jack is on here as well, which I
was using Wolfman Jack's newscaster.
Really?
Yes, for a couple of years, actually.
I had no idea.
KDAY.
I have asked people about this before. I spoke to Mort Krim a few weeks ago, asked him about like his training in terms of like losing his accent or having a certain voice. I am curious, did you go through any voice training to get that broadcaster voice you were talking about at the beginning of the episode, or is it something you develop on your own?
No, everybody had to talk that way.
Yeah, yeah.
I interviewed Elvis when I was early on. I'm one of the few people who ever interviewed Elvis, 1956. And I was using that voice back then. And I interviewed him at the Shrine Auditorium in Los Angeles, just walked into his dressing room, set up my equipment, and he walked in, did the interview, and I walked out. But I said during the interview, and I think that this is online, so you could find this recording. But I said, Mr. Presley, I understand that a city in Northern California has banned your music on the grounds that it contributes to juvenile delinquency. How do you respond to that? And he says, well, I think that's just nonsense. If the person wants to be a juvenile delinquent, he's going to be a juvenile delinquent even if he reads Mother Goose.
I love it. That's
we were the same age, you know.
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah.
I think I'm like 8 months older than Elvis.
Wow. When did you? Sorry, I'm always curious about voice work, and because you literally just did an impression of how you used to talk, at least professionally. When did you drop it? When did you decide I don't need to do this anymore? This is not how I speak professionally.
I think when I saw video of myself.
Okay, you know what? That's fair.
Yeah, it's just ridiculous. But everybody tried to talk that way.
Yeah, no, of course.
That was a condition of getting hired. Certainly, I didn't want to use that when I was on KRLA. But
right.
But the other newscasters did. I mean, just really boomed down. You could hear their voice down the hall.
That's amazing.
Yeah. Yeah.
My late father-in-law was a DJ in the 60s and the 70s, and he, not that, he was a DJ, but also sort of that basso profundo, like he had a big rib cage so he could use it. But it's so funny because that is not the way the man spoke in real life, and like it is very funny to have a voice to put on for the radio in any instance, but especially for news. Wow, that's very funny to me.
Well, look at Wolfman. I knew him as Bob Stiff. I never called him Wolfman, but that voice was put on. He'd get into the studio, smoke a joint, and get into his personality.
Did he ever do any interviews speaking as himself? I'm now wondering. I don't know if he ever did any interviews speaking just as himself.
I doubt it.
Right?
Yeah.
Right? I mean, that's...
For a long time, people didn't know whether he was black or white,
That's interesting.
He didn't do interviews at all.
Yeah, because I mean, I think I'm sure the first time I knew who he was at all was when my parents showed me American Graffiti as a kid. I think it's maybe the only time I learned who he was at all. But yeah, that's interesting. What an interesting career that guy had too. Lou, I very much appreciate talking with you, not just about the record, but about your career. And I know there's a billion other things I could ask you about, but and I think we've made the argument for why to give this record a listen, because it is, and for any of those out there who are interested in the credibility gap, this is a very different thing from the other records and worth listening to, because it is, and I'm going to say what everybody says, it's a snapshot of the time, but not just a snapshot of the time. It's from a single day. It was recorded in a single day, or at least just a few hours. And that's remarkable. That's not something I think I've heard yet on this show, where somebody said, yeah, we recorded the whole thing just like that. And I think it's interesting to listen to with that in mind. I'm going to have to re-listen to it with that in mind. This will come out in a few weeks. Do you have anything you'd like to promote or tell people about? Stuff they should look out for?
No. Not really. I wish I had something to promote.
That's fine. We'll just pre-promote your book. This is where Lou Irwin's book will go. And if it ever happens, we'll happily promote it on the show, because I want to.
Well, you can promote. It's hardly comedy, but I did write a book a couple of years ago about the bombing of the LA Times in 1910.
Oh, yeah.
And that's out there, and it's worth a read.
Yes, please. Read Lou's book. And
it's called Deadly Times, the 1910 bombing of the Los Angeles Times, and America's forgotten decade of terror, something. I can't remember the name of my own book. I mean, getting old.
Here we go. It is Deadly Times, the 1910 bombing of the Los Angeles Times, and America's forgotten decade of terror. Oh, I'm assuming I can get it on Amazon. I'm betting I can get it on Amazon. Yes. Okay, good. Yes. Pick up that book. Thank you again very much for doing the show.
Well, thank you. I enjoyed it.
Thank you guys for listening. And as always, have good things. Comedy on Vinyl is a production of Stolen Dress Entertainment. It is produced by Mike Warden and is hosted and edited by Jason Klom. Our theme song was composed and performed by Richard Levinson. You can email us at podcast@comedyonvinyl.com. You can also send snail mail to Stolen Dress Entertainment, P.O. Box 805, Burbank, California, 91503. Subscribe to Comedy on Vinyl on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and anywhere else you can find podcasts. Give us a 5-star rating and write us a review. It helps. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Comedy on Vinyl, or find everything in one place at comedyonvinyl.com. A major portion of Comedy on Vinyl has been underwritten by Stand Up Records. Please visit standuprecords.com for all your comedy needs, and tune in to the new Stand Up Records channel available on the Roku, where you can also find select episodes of this podcast. Visit stolendress.com to listen to our other podcasts, watch videos, and imbibe freely of our multimedia content going back 15 plus years. Stolen Dress Entertainment.
Hey, it's my turn. Ah!